In 1966, a disaster scarred a village in South Wales. What happened was unthinkable. A coal tip on a mountain slope above the village of Aberfan collapsed, crashing directly into a local school below it. In an instant, much of a village's generation was lost. Many of those who survived were traumatised for the rest of their lives. But what does this tragedy have to do with Queen Elizabeth? That's what episode 3 of The Crown's 3rd season deals with, as we see Queen Elizabeth grapple with what it means to be the stoic figurehead of a nation in the face of unimaginable tragedy. It also shows how the events which followed reportedly became one of the greatest regrets of Queen Elizabeth's reign. In this video, we're going to tell you more about what happened, some of the reasons why, and what happened afterwards. As with everything in The Crown, the episode was meticulously researched, but it is a drama, so some creative license is used to drive the personal stories. Class is a recurring theme in this series of The Crown, but it's never more pertinent than in this episode. So to understand the story behind it, you also need to understand the history of mining towns and villages in South Wales. From the 19th century until the early 20th century, coal mining was crucial to Wales and parts of the north of England. Mines provided jobs, which in turn created pockets of mining communities spreading across areas like the South Wales valleys. By the 1960s, mining was beginning to dwindle due to competition from oil. Yet, coal mining still fueled the community of not just Aberfan, but neighbouring villages too. Think of the mine as the central hub of this village. If no one in your family worked there, someone you knew definitely did. It was dangerous work. But people assumed it was dangerous for miners, not their families. Surrounding these mines were huge tips built from waste produced during the mining process. The tips were known to slip. In fact, there were 3 previous significant tip slides, but none to the extent tip number 7 did in 1966.
I've never seen one this bad before.
That tip in particular had concerned the people of Aberfan for years, because it was located almost directly above Pantglas Junior School, the local primary. What's more, it was discovered the coal waste lay on top of a mountain spring, which meant the whole thing was dangerously fluid. At the time, the mines were run by the National Coal Board, a statutory corporation set up by the British government when mines were nationalised in 1947. 3 years before the disaster, a waterworks engineer wrote to the coal board about the danger the tip posed. Local councillors also warned of the danger. Parents from Pantglas School signed a petition. They were ignored.
We've been telling everyone for years those tips were dangerous.
Here's what happened that day. For weeks beforehand, the Merthyr Valley had been hit by a torrential downpour, turning the tip to slurry. Workers arrived in the morning to find it had sunk dangerously by about 10 feet. There were no phone lines working up there that day, so workers hurried their way down the mountain to warn bosses of the danger.
Something's not right.
What do you mean?
We should get a safety team up there now.
But it was too late.
Someone needs to check it out.
Be quiet!
The tip began to fall at approximately 9:15 a.m. Just as children had sat down on the morning of what was the last day before half-term. If the tip had fallen just 20 minutes earlier, the story may well have been entirely different. The teachers had just begun taking their attendance when the landslide hit. An avalanche of liquefied slurry tore down the mountain, reaching speeds of 30 to 40 miles per hour. Survivors who were inside the school described hearing a thunderous noise, like a jet plane, as the avalanche approached. As had long been feared by those who had warned the National Coal Board, the mud crashed directly into the school and many of the neighbouring houses. It happened so quickly, there was barely time to react. As soon as news of the tragedy spread, people from across South Wales arrived in Aberfan to help. Miners found themselves digging for their own children. Initially, they worried about bringing in mechanical diggers, fearing their weight would crush anyone trapped underneath. So many began digging with their bare hands. Whenever anyone in the rescue effort thought they heard someone buried under the heap of dirt, a whistle was blown, stopping everyone in their tracks. While some children were pulled out alive, the rescue effort was unimaginably difficult due to the sheer amount of hardened slurry. In the end, 116 children and 28 adults were found dead, and it took a week to find them all because there was so much to dig through. As shown in the episode, the local chapel became a makeshift mortuary. In the show, Queen Elizabeth eventually visits Aberfan following the threat of criticism from the press.
The very last thing emergency and rescue services need when they're working against the clock is a Queen turning up.
In real life, it did indeed take the Queen 8 days to visit Aberfan. Later, in 2002, it was reported the Queen said her biggest regret was not visiting Aberfan immediately after the disaster. Buckingham Palace has never confirmed nor denied this, but the Queen, out of all the royals, has returned to Aberfan the most. What you don't see in the episode is what happened later. PTSD was common in those children who did survive the disaster, many of them suffering from survivor's guilt, as they attempted to come to terms both with the death of their friends and with their own personal trauma. Minors, too, felt overwhelming guilt, as did parents who wished they'd stopped their children from going to school that day. Bereaved parents struggled with even seeing other children out in the streets. The entire village was in mourning. The children who died became known as Aberfan's lost generation. We see a taste of their grief and anger towards the National Coal Board in the episode.
Will you both accept responsibility?
This anger spilled into the official inquest into the deaths. One father shouted,
"Buried alive by the National Coal Board. That's what I want to see written on my child's desk."
Another person who didn't go to the site of the disaster immediately was the chairman of the National Coal Board, Lord Robbins, preferring instead to continue with a ceremony installing him as the Chancellor of the University of Surrey. The day after his eventual visit, he was interviewed by a television news team, claiming no one from the board knew there was a spring underneath the tip. The NCB resisted taking the blame, claiming the disaster was down to the heavy rain and other geological factors.
National Coal Board cannot accept responsibility for the weather.
Ultimately, a tribunal placed the blame for the disaster entirely with the NCB, criticising a complete lack of policy when it came to dealing with the tips. It was the largest tribunal in British history, with around 130 witnesses. Yet, no one was prosecuted, and no one from the board lost their job as a result. Lord Robbins publicly offered his resignation.
But I felt the circumstances were such that my resignation should be offered, and therefore it's really a matter for the government to decide whether they accept my resignation.
But papers released decades later revealed he had only done so when he was assured his job was safe. Not only did he remain in his post, he was appointed to chair a committee which made recommendations about health and safety regulations. In the years since the disaster, it also emerged how badly the victims' families were treated as the NCB attempted to dodge responsibility. A study from 2000 found the board and the government of the day were extremely insensitive to the victims' families. Dr. Ian McLean, one of the authors of the report, said victims' families were treated as troublemakers, and there was further hurt still for those families. A disaster fund set up by the mayor of Merthyr Tydfil had drawn donations from all over the world, with a final total of around 1.75 million. As legal battles over the fund continued, residents from the village had begun a campaign to remove the tips surrounding Aberfan, fearing they could collapse once again. But the NCB refused to take financial responsibility for the removal of the tips. In the end, the government took $150,000 from the fund to make up the funds needed to get rid of the tips. It was yet another blow to the community, described by the press as the second disaster to befall Aberfan. That money was only repaid in 1997, but without accounting for inflation. With inflation, that amount would have been over £1 million. The Crown's writer, Peter Morgan, said he had always planned to cover Aberfan in the series. The team behind the show worked with the people of the village to ensure the story was told with sensitivity, as well as to bring the history to a wider, global audience. The community was involved from the very beginning. Some people, who were relatives or neighbours of those who died in Aberfan, appeared as extras in some scenes. Ynys Owen Male Voice Choir, which was set up after the disaster, sings in the episode. The team decided not to film in Aberfan itself, choosing nearby Cwmaman instead. An empty school there became Pantglas, while the towering tip was recreated in CGI. A rain machine recreated the torrential downpour which fell on the valleys in the days leading up to the disaster. More than 50 years on, the trauma following the disaster still remains, as producers found when they held a public meeting with people from the village. Everyone at that meeting, on set, and at the subsequent screening of the episode held in Aberfan, were offered therapy. It's important to remember the deep trauma Aberfan caused not just to the area, but to Wales as a whole, as it became a symbol of corporate negligence towards the working classes. Today, Aberfan is a very different place to the village we see in The Crown. The Merthyr Vale colliery closed in 1989, as have most of the mines in South Wales, and the tips are long gone. The school has been replaced by a memorial garden. But the village has never forgotten what happened there 53 years ago.